have this every first Monday of every month, and it's usually at 6 o'clock, and it's right here in this room. So we have a scientist every Monday of every first month, and that scientist...
during the academic year.
During the academic year, right? We don't have them during the summer and during the off-season, but how many people know what Sigma Xi is? Sigma Xi is the National Research Society, Honor Society in Science. And I have here some brochures, if you guys want to pick them up, that explains about the society. They're the only society in all of the world which is international and embraces all the sciences. And they do many, many things. They give grants to students, they support research, they do a whole lot. And we are the University of Montana chapter. So, with that in mind, I'm going to introduce our speaker. She is Dr. Eugenie Scott, and she is the Executive Director of the National Center for Science Education, based very close to Berkeley. Oakland, very close to Berkeley. And, And don't think it's Oakland, New Zealand, but also Auckland. Anyway, we're going to be hearing some very interesting stuff about evolution and creationism. Now, the way this thing works is there is questions, she'll give a little presentation, then she'll walk around with the microphone, talk to you, and entertain questions and discussions. The whole idea of Science Cafe is to engage the public, to get you guys to interact and talk. That's the whole idea. So, Dr. Scott is our visiting scientist today, and she has a reputation of 25 years of her support of evolution and many, many causes. I'm not going to go into all of the things that she's done, but I have you know that she's appeared on most TV shows and news media. She's had a lot of coverage, and we're really glad to have her here. She is an expert on the evolution and creation topic. And without any more, just give her a big hand.
Good evening, and I'm so pleased that there's such a good turnout for this Science Cafe. You never really know how many people or who's going to show up for these. You know, Science Cafes are really sprouting up all over the country. We've got a number of them in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've spoken at other Science Cafes in other cities, so it's really a lot of fun to be here with you folks today, because this is a great idea. Somebody was, forget it, what it, it was a cartoon that I was looking at on George's, the door of George's office, and talking about it. Well, I wonder why science doesn't get more respect. And the second panel had the other person asking, would you buy a ticket to go hear a scientist? The third panel is no. Well, there you've got it. So, you know, so we do the best we can. We don't sell tickets to science cafes, but at least people show up, and at least they buy beer. So, you know, what more can you ask? Sorry. Poor sound guys just got hacking. Let me tell you a little bit about the National Center for Science Education, because that will tell you a little bit about me and why I'm here and why I have the odd job that I have. I am a former college professor. I'm a physical anthropologist by training. I actually did real science before, you know, I was a real scientist before playing one on television. But the National Center for Science Education is not actually what it sounds. It has this very grand name. But actually, it concentrates on a fairly narrow area of science education. It concentrates on evolution education and education in the nature of science. And yes, we are generally interested in these topics and how they are taught in American public schools, but specifically, we were founded by a group of scientists and teachers back in the 1980s, fortunately, who were very concerned about efforts to get creationism into the public school science class. And this group of scientists and teachers banded together to provide the kind of information that scientists and teachers can provide in these kinds of conflicts. Fundamentally, these are political issues. If the creation and evolution conflict were about science, I could go home. I mean, I could retire because we won. Okay, this is not an issue of science. It is an issue that deals with scientific topics, and indeed we have a great job ahead of us as people who are interested in science, in communicating science to the general public and helping the general public understand science better and understand evolution better. But fundamentally, the problem is not scientific. Believe me, people do not line up 10 and 15 people deep at school board meetings because they're worried about the Cambrian explosion, all right? This is not why people get excited about evolution. They get excited about evolution because they believe that it conflicts with their religious views, and they don't want their kids to be taught evolution in the public schools. And this is a very sincere and very strongly held belief. And if you understand where these people are coming from, you can sort of understand why they fight so hard to get evolution out of the schools or get some form of creationism in. They really believe that if evolution is taught, then their children are going to believe, quote, believe in evolution. If their child believes in evolution, their child will give up their faith in God. If you give up your faith in God, then you will not be saved. So this is a really important issue for conservative Christians, and very, very highly motivating. I assure you, the scientific community is not nearly as highly motivated to keep evolution in, which is one reason, frankly, why we need an organization like the National Center for Science Education, because we are your surrogate activists, if you will. We will provide the information to the local school boards or to those parents who, want their kids to be taught good science, or who don't want to have religious views being passed off as science in the science classes. And we will provide them with the scientific information or the pedagogical information or even the religious and legal information that they need to make a good argument. But fundamentally, these kinds of issues are issues of politics, because American education is very highly politicized. We have a decentralized education system, which means decisions are made locally in local school boards and maybe secondarily at the state level, but many more decisions are made locally than are made at the state level. And the local decisions are governed by an elected school board. Now, as soon as you say elected, you're dealing with politics, which is why we have a politicized education system and why the creation and evolution issue is such a contentious one and has continued for so many decades. There is a natural tendency of school boards to want to make all of the voters happy. So if Group A comes up and says 2 + 2 is 4, and Group B comes up and says 2 + 2 is 6, the natural compromise of a school board is to say, okay, 2 + 2 is 5. And this makes a lot of sense to school board member because you're keeping, people in the community happy. But as we know, sometimes 2 + 2 just has to equal 4. And when it comes to good science education, we have to teach evolution. We cannot bring in religious views masquerading as science. Let me give you a little quick rundown of the issues as far as the creation evolution controversy. At NCSC, we have what we call the pillars of creationism. These are the 3 classes of arguments in which, really for 25 plus years, we've been able to put any creationist argument will fall into one of these 3 categories. The first one is that evolution is shaky science. Did you know that scientists are giving up on evolution? How many of you in this audience are scientists, just for fun? I won't call on you. Keep your hands up, boys and girls. I won't call on you. You are safe. Keep your hands up. All right. I saw that hand go down. You keep your hand up. All right. Now, hands up. Come on, keep it up. Thank you. All right. Now, all of you people who are scientists, how many of you think evolution is a weak or inadequate theory? Not a lot. Well, no, obviously. I mean, this idea that scientists are somehow bailing on evolution is one of these things that if you repeat it 3 times, it becomes true, you know. But we get so many letters to the editor sent to us from our members around the country of somebody writing in saying, well, scientists are giving up on evolution, we shouldn't be teaching it. The second pillar is a very familiar one. This is the idea that faith and science are incompatible. Specifically, evolution and Christian faith are incompatible. You have to choose. And this has been a very, very difficult issue to deal with for many, many years. But it's dealable with, as it were. It is not the most insurmountable problem. The third of the pillars is actually the hardest one to deal with, even though it is no more valid than the other two. The third pillar is fairness. Well, if you teach evolution, it's only fair that you teach something to balance it. Well, if people in the community really don't like evolution, it's only fair if you just not teach it, or teach both. 2 + 2 is 5. And the fairness argument is not valid. I mean, you know, we don't teach standard World War II history and Holocaust revisionism because it's fair. We teach standard history in the schools. But it's attractive because it really taps into American cultural values. We really like fairness. We like town hall meetings. We like letting everybody have their say. Everybody has a right to their opinion, and on and on and on. And so fairness is a really attractive idea to a lot of Americans. I've spoken to teachers who know that something called creation science, which is an effort to take biblical literalism and support it with science. It fails miserably, but it's called creation science. I've known teachers who know that creation science is bunk when it comes to science, that there's no science to it. But still, they think it's only fair. So the fairness issue really resonates with Americans. And it requires a certain amount of treatment, shall we say. You need to really, it's a useful thing to know how to deal with this argument. By the way, can everybody hear me okay? Good. Am I too loud? Okay, good. One way of dealing with the fairness issue is to point out that fairness and equal time and free expression is an extremely important thing. We cherish it in America, but it has to do with opinions. And whether the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth, whether water flows downhill or uphill, whether you can get free energy or not, second law of thermodynamics, those are not opinions, okay? In the same sense that your views on abortion or medical care or something else are opinions. So we cherish free speech, but it has to do with freedom of expression of opinions, not with whether a scientific view is a valid scientific view. An idea may be incredibly unpopular, but if it works, scientists will use it. Sometimes when I'm doing a lecture for biologists, I'll make a joke, and I'll say, how many of you would prefer to vote in Lamarckism over natural selection? And of course all the hands go up, because anybody who understands natural selection, it's a terrible way of getting species. I mean, you have this huge amount of death and waste and infertility and nasty, brutish, and short. I mean, you don't want to go there. If you could actually vote in the inheritance of acquired characteristics, it's a much more benign way of getting species to adapt. So it's a big joke among biologists. The fact of the matter is that natural selection works, the inheritance of acquired characteristics doesn't. So as a result, in high school or in college, we teach the science that works, whether it's popular or unpopular. Okay, I've spoken enough. The creationism and evolution controversy has gone on for several decades, clearly. And it's gone on because aspects of it resonate with American culture, but also because we have a particular form of Christianity in the United States that tends to be more conservative than the Christianity that you find, say, in Europe or Great Britain. One reason why we have a more conservative Christianity is that it was in the United States much more recently than most people think, in the 19-teens, that a particular form of Protestant religion was invented in North America, in the United States, called fundamentalism. And it was a much more biblically literalist type of Christianity than had been the case. And, you know, Catholics are not biblical literalists. Most mainstream Protestants are not biblical literalists. In the United States, we tend to think of, you know, the 6 24-hour days of Genesis and the special creation of all the kinds and of Adam and Eve. We tend to think that that's typical Christianity, but it's not. It's only one, actually rather narrow form of Christianity that on a worldwide basis is not the majority at all. But it is a fairly strong, about 30% of Americans fall into that particular religious persuasion in our country. So that tends to color our attitude toward the Christian religion and also color the attitude toward the creationism issue. But this is supposed to be a conversation, and I will do my Oprah imitation here with my microphone, because if you just ask a question, only the people sitting at your table are likely to hear you because there's a lot of background noise. So I would be more than happy to share this microphone with anybody, more than one person. And it doesn't have to be a you speaking to Eugenie kind of thing. It can be you speaking to each other, which is actually preferred. So, what are your interests when it comes to the creationism and evolution issue? Good thing I took off my heels. I'm in my running shoes here.
So do you ever use this argument, and if you do, what's the counter argument? Evolution is the mechanism of creation. It's a showstopper.
Thank you. The idea that evolution is the way God brought about the universe and living things is the fundamental concept of something called theistic evolution, which is, if any of you went to Catholic schools, this is what you learned. It's the Catholic mainstream position, it's the mainstream Protestant position, theistic evolution. I don't argue that because I'm a scientist. I have on many occasions, I talk about science and religion a lot. I describe a variety of religious positions. I don't advocate, that one above biblical literalism or anything else. But, when you come, one of the things that I talk with high school teachers about is that although it would not be appropriate for them to advocate that point of view any more than it would be appropriate for them to advocate biblical literalism, you can educate your students in a descriptive sense about a variety of views. And actually that has a remarkable effect upon high school kids. It's sort of like, oh, I thought you had to choose. They come in thinking there's this dichotomous choice. You're either a good guy Christian creationist on one side or you're a bad guy atheist evolutionist on the other side. And just exposing students to the existence of this view that he was describing, a theistic evolution view, is sort of like, oh, I've got a choice. It's a choice the kid has to make. The teacher is not, should not be in the business of advocating any religious position or anti-religion. But I agree with you completely. It's a very useful thing for people to know about. Next.
You didn't ask people in the audience to raise their hands. I'm particularly interested in those people who work in the field of rhetoric and communication. So I would ask, is there a way you can bring these two groups together in the classroom so that we are accommodating?
What?
That has to be rhetoric.
Well, can we bring the two sides together into a classroom and get them comfortable with each other using the skills of communication, of The extreme creationist position in which evolution is completely unacceptable because it so conflicts with their interpretation of their faith, and it is a key tenet of the faith, because they really believe that if Adam and Eve were not specially created by God, then their fall makes no sense, then the sacrifice of Christ for our sins make no sense, and all of Christianity crumbles. Now, other Christians don't view that, but that's what they, so, they're never going to be able to say evolution's okay. Where I think a reasonable compromise lies is getting religious conservatives to agree to let evolution be taught. Their kids don't have to accept it. That's fine. I mean, we're not in the business of imposing any kind of intellectual orthodoxy. A kid who doesn't want to believe that the World War II happened doesn't have to believe World War II happened, whatever. But they do have to learn it in order to be educated. And actually, I have encouraged teachers to use that approach in dealing with conservative Christian parents who are, don't want them to teach evolution. Make it clear to the parent that their kid just has to learn it to be educated. It's okay, nobody's going to be holding the child up to ridicule if he doesn't, quote, believe evolution. And by the way, it's not just scare quotes. I mean, scientists don't believe in, Mendel's law of independent assortment. I mean, we don't believe in scientific views. That gets more like opinions, right? So I always use the word accept evolution rather than believe evolution, because I want to try to separate science from beliefs. You believe in God, you accept evolution. I don't know if that helped your... Okay. Would you pass this over to that gentleman in the corner? Not you, you're eating. Pass that over to the gentleman with the white beard.
The one I was astounded actually by your claim that 30% of Americans fall into that category. I live in Ravalli County. I think it's way more than that. But still, I think 30% seems like a really high number. I mean, maybe it's right, but I'm shocked at that's a big number. That was just a comment. The Institute for Creation Research prides itself in the fact that it's based on science, that they do interpret the Bible literally, and New Age, Young Earth, all of that, but they base it on what they claim to be science. It appears that what they're really doing is they're really focusing on that first issue about shaky science. They're trying to just knock the science. But what do they claim as their basis, their scientific basis? If any.
Our friends at the Institute for Creation Research do indeed start with a literal view of the Bible, and then they look for evidence that would seem to support it. But of course, there isn't a lot of evidence that supports the idea of special creation. So they have what they call the two-model approach, and you'll find this throughout their literature. And this is the idea that there's only two possibilities. There's either evolution or special creation. And so given these two, if you disprove evolution, notice how cleverly I use the right finger for making that point. If you disprove evolution, that leaves creationism standing without having to be demonstrated, because that's, it wins by default. So most of the literature is, as you say, focused on that first pillar of trying to demonstrate that evolution is shaky science. A lot of the arguments that you find in the creation science literature are rate, R-A-T-E, rate, like in rate of change. They're rate arguments, because critical to their position is demonstrating that the Earth is only a few thousand years old. Because if the Earth is young, then clearly there's not enough time for evolution, and they win. Evolution is disproved if the Earth is only 10,000 years old. So lots and lots of their work has to do with sifting through the scientific literature and finding the little anomalous claim that they can hold up and say, see, we told you the Earth was young, therefore evolution didn't happen. For example, they'll cite articles in the real scientific literature, like an article in Science or Nature, where the rate of oil seepage in underwater oil vents has been measured to be so many gallons a day. If, as you evolutionists say, the rate of oil seepage is X number of barrels per day, I guess it would be barrels, not gallons, barrels per day, and if the Earth was as old as you say it was, the oceans would be all full of oil. Clearly the oceans are not full of oil. Clearly that means that that the planet could not be as old as you evolutionists say it is. Therefore evolution didn't happen. And they just go after example like that. The rate of the displacement of the moon from the Earth is such and such. Therefore, if the planet Earth was really as old as you evolutionists say it is, the moon would be way the hell out someplace. And since it isn't, that means the Earth is young. They never met a rate they didn't love. And they will go through the scientific literature, cherry picking all these little funny anomalous kinds of observations and just wave them with great enthusiasm. And that's creation science. It's finding evidence, as they would put it, that evolution doesn't work, so that therefore special creation wins by default. The statistic of about 30% I did qualify because it's a really hard statistic to come up with. First of all, words like evangelical, words like fundamentalist, words like charismatic, adjectives that are used to describe specific religious meanings are not used consistently, even by the people who use them. Probably charismatic or Pentecostal is probably more specific, but the term evangelical is very poorly understood. In general, fundamentalists are more conservative than evangelicals, for example. I mean, there are these nuances. There's a website called barna.org. That's B-A-R-N-A, barna.org. Man's name is somebody Barna. And he does a lot of survey research. And it looks like it's pretty solid stuff in terms of his description of how he selects his samples and the sample sizes that he uses and how he phrases questions. Barna also is a evangelical Christian, and he's very interested in religion and American life. And so he polls a lot, he runs a lot of surveys about asking religious questions of average American adult population. And it's his statistic that I'm working with. He actually says 40% of Americans would fall into the conservative Christian category of some degree of biblical literalism in their theology. And of course that ranges greatly too. For my purposes, that's the biblical literalism that really is the biggest stumbling point. So I'm interested in that fraction of Americans who hold to that position. I think 40% is a little high myself, but it's a substantial number of American Christians at any rate. Of course, the largest number of American Christians still remains Catholics. Approximately half of American Christians are Catholics. But a large percent of American Christians are starting to, or have for the last 15 or 20 years, moved to the more conservative Protestant denominations. Although interestingly enough, another big movement in the last 10 years has been to these big community churches that tend to be, theologically vacuous. It's sort of, well, come, and Wednesday we have the sewing circle, and Tuesday is for the, senior ukulele group, and Wednesday we have the high school band, and something, your whole life focuses around that big megachurch. But theologically, I mean, it's a real social kind of thing, but theologically these people, who knows what they believe in. It's just, that's not a big part of the experience. But anyway.
Eugenie, believe it or not, I was the keynote speaker for a group of 200 retired Lutheran ministers in Cedar Lake. They had their retreat. And my topic was intelligent design. And the first time I said it, they said intelligent design, and it sounds like a good idea. And they were really surprised when I told them the real motives and what their goals are. Could you speak about intelligent design?
Intelligent design is kind of the new creationist kid on the block. It's a more recent anti-evolution development, shall we say. It's had kind of an interesting history, which I won't go into in great detail, but we have been talking a little bit about creation science, which is more the biblically literalist-oriented form of creationism. And this movement ran into a real buzzsaw called the First Amendment. And when they tried to get laws passed, equal time for teaching creation science and evolution, the court struck them down as being in violation of the Establishment Clause. Understandably, it's definitely an advocacy of religion kind of issue. Seeing the failure of creation science, a group of conservative Christians wanted to try to come up with something else, so to speak, that wouldn't make the mistakes of creation science by being too explicit about the fact claims. By the way, they do some wonderful things with the glacial Lake Missoula, but that's another. But so, you know, because creation science would make claims like Grand Canyon was cut by Noah's flood, you can deal with that. You can show that that's wrong. Why should we teach that to kids in school? It's just bad science, right? So for that reason, the formulators of what became intelligent design decided that they would reduce the number of claims that were made in the name of this new anti-evolutionism that they were going to come up with. And they focused on what is perhaps the most attractive aspect of creationism, which is the design argument. The idea that, I mean, if you look around at the marvelous complexity of so many structures in nature, from the classics like the vertebrate eye, you know, the human eye, to various biochemical constructs, the immune system, the immune cascade is this really fabulously complicated cascade of biochemistry that results in our being able to fight off microorganisms and diseases and like. I mean, there's just wonderfully complicated things. You know, the fact that in cosmology, the physicists tell us that only very tiny differences in various constants, like the temperature at which water freezes, for example, all these things that, you know, had they been slightly different, life would probably never have evolved. I mean, there's all these kinds of really interesting, statistically improbable or incredibly complicated or impressive structures and considerations in nature. Their argument is that those kinds of phenomena couldn't possibly be the result of a natural cause. Anything that's that complicated, like the vertebrate eye, had to be the result of intelligent cause. And of course, the intelligent cause spells its name with 3 letters. The first is G. You can probably guess the other 2 letters. But they never mention God. They never mention religion. This is all done in sort of a airy-fairy, hand-waving information theory, information theoretic kind of, you know, it's all a bunch of BS, but they try to couch this as if this is very sophisticated science. But when you really boil it boils down to an attitude about nature, that nature is random, it's chaotic, it's unformed, as opposed to intelligence, which of course is orderly, it's purposeful, it's artifactual, if you will. And you know, what we know from nature is that there's a tremendous amount of organization in nature. We call them laws of nature, if we're clumsy in their use of the scientific terms. There are regularities by which nature operates, which of course science is very interested in trying to discern and trying to understand. And you know, we don't, Newton didn't need the fine, you know, the God with the screwdriver fine-tuning the universe at every turn. You know, Newton, who was a very devout man, came up with the idea of the created laws governing the clockwork universe. Well, we don't quite have a clockwork universe these days with quantum stuff, but it's still, on the macro level, it's still clockwork, whatever. But the whole design argument really expresses this very primitive view of nature, and a really uninformed view of what we know about the regularities of nature and our ability to understand them through science. But the intelligent design people did focus on this very narrow aspect of creation science and fooled a lot of people for a while. They did fool a lot of theologians, but not for very long, because pretty quickly mainstream and process theologians figured out that what they were arguing was a very old-fashioned interventionist God that was just, sticking that screwdriver into the universe at every turn, which from the standpoint of most liberal Christianity is a terrible view of God. That's the last kind of God you want, because that's an incompetent God who can't get it right the first time. And plus there's other theological reasons for not wanting the frequent intervention. So I'm not surprised that your group of Lutheran theologians, once they learned, even better, once they learned what intelligent design was, decided that this really wasn't for them. I've heard that again as well from other ministers and theologians. Yes?
Well, we've talked a lot about formal education and what we can do to help students understand evolutionary theory. Most people spend a significant part of their life outside of school, however, and informal education is something we do need to be concerned with. Montana has its own creationist museum, even on the Dinosaur Trail.
Right.
And so I'm wondering what kind of strategies you might offer in terms of addressing informal science evolution education.
Can I ask one question? Where is this? Can we
It's
see?
Glendive.
Glendive.
It's a small one.
It's pretty modest. I have to come back to Montana and see the Glendive Museum, obviously. Take a field trip. But I've seen the website, and it's a pretty modest endeavor. But nonetheless, I'm sure they're packing them in. And the website, they claim, and in his newsletter, he's claiming that he's bringing school children there. Although whether that is public school children or Christian school children, the implication in one letter that he sent out to his mailing list that we have our tentacles out getting is that this was public school children being taken to the Glendive Museum. That is a matter of some concern, ladies and gentlemen. As far as, the reason why I obsess about schools is because the problem has to do with pressure upon the middle school and high school curriculum to get evolution out. The lovely thing about being a person interested in science these days is that there are so many wonderful sources of information about science, partly because of the internet, but also you still have Scientific American, you still have Discovery, you still have, there was a third one, what am I thinking of? Pardon me? New Scientist, yeah, that's another wonderful. And Science News is another wonderful. There are some really good, and American Scientists, that's true. Yes, Sigma Xi.
And you are a member.
And I am a member. I am a member of the Berkeley chapter of Sigma Xi. But, and also there's wonderful books that are written for the educated, the interested lay public. Anything by Sean Carroll is fabulous. He just does. He's our replacement Steve Gould. He really is. He is just such a marvelous science writer. Anything by Carl Zimmer is wonderful. Jonathan Wiener's Beak of the Finch is still fabulous. You got another?
Are those appropriate for a young audience?
Oh well.
Like middle school? Do you have
If he's a really, really good reader. Some of the Sean, yeah, they're generally written more for adults, but Carl Zimmer's stuff is very accessible, his books, and he actually has a textbook out on evolution, which does not look like a textbook, which I think recommends it highly, of course. But it is written for classroom use, but it's this conversational, wonderful presentation of the science of evolution. There's great stuff on Nova going back years and years. You know, even the old 2001 evolution series that Nova came up with, the 6 hours that they did, that's still being broadcast because it's just such solid science. I mean, huh? Well, talk to your PBS station to do it. Well, I don't know the local details. So, you know, as somebody, as an adult wanting to educate yourself more about evolution, there's lots of opportunities. It's much better these days than it has been in the past. Yes?
I have 2 questions, I think. One of them is, for those of us that are in science and that are biologists, the question is, what is the deal? Why are we scared? I mean, how is it that it's so difficult to show the science with the evidence? Why is this an issue? Why is it? I mean, you guys are a bunch of really creative, intelligent people. Why does it continue to be an issue?
Because it's not about the science. If it were about the science, we could all go home. Game over, we win. It's not about the science, it's about people's attitude toward evolution and what they believe are the consequences of evolution for their faith. You know, did you?
So,
I think it's also about attitudes towards science. And I think there's a political context here that I would like for you to comment on. And specifically, you know, as a Sputnik baby, I never encountered in my school, nor did I encounter from my parents, one of whom was a Southern Baptist and the other who was an Orthodox Jew, any argument that evolution is anything but just a self-evident fact. And so you mentioned earlier that the 40% undergoes a fluctuation. And so it strikes me that this debate has become much more strident and much more public over the last 20 years. It was not an issue back in the 1960s and 1970s. Why is it an issue now?
The same in Europe.
And the same as in Europe.
In Europe, it was not an issue.
We both grew up in the 60s. I graduated in high school in 63. There was no evolution in my high school biology. Okay.
So when I was going through my mother's books, and there were many of them after her death, I found her high school science book.
Right.
This is Mississippi Delta, in the 1930s. And this book was notable for its complete absence, of a creationist twist. It was completely Darwinism, albeit pre-neo-Darwinism.
Right.
The mechanism of inheritance was not known at that time, but the process of evolution by natural selection was taken as a given. And in fact, there was this marvelous, large inner chapter that was probably a fourth of the book that's doing evolution with gun and line. The idea that this was a book that was written for farm kids, for ranch kids, and that the power of death in the natural world would be something that would be self-evident to them as basically the decisive force in natural selection. And so I'm surprised to hear you say that was not in the textbook, because it was back in the deep South, believe it or not.
No, I'll tell you exactly why.
And I'm with you in Spain. Evolution was not taught either in school, but so that was definitely that it was not an issue.
there has been some very interesting scholarship tracing the coverage of evolution in high school textbooks. A guy by the name of Gerald Skog from Texas Tech has got the story here. I think, well, textbooks before the Scopes trial of 1925 included evolution. Scopes lost, okay? Scopes lost. The anti-evolution bill in, anti-evolution law in Tennessee remained on the books, actually until the 60s, but that's another. A very pernicious thing happened after the Scopes trial, which was that evolution quietly disappeared from textbooks by the publishers. The publishers realized that they're going to sell more books if they just take evolution. They're going to sell more books in the South, especially in the Midwest, if they just take evolution out. And nobody really noticed in the North because, you know, they weren't paying attention either. According to Jerry, by about 1930, which was right around the time you're talking about, most of the evolution was pretty much gone from high school textbooks. That was only 5 years since the Scopes trial. It remained not a part of the high school curriculum until the 1960s. What happened in 1958, Sputnik, fellow Sputnik baby, the Russians beat us to space. And for those of us of a certain age, this was a horrifying experience. This was a great stain on the honor of America that those communists had beaten us to space. And so the federal government, God bless it, poured tons of money into the brand new National Science Foundation to support science research. Oh, what a thought. Maybe the government should support science research like every other developed country in the world. And even more importantly, in my opinion, they also started pouring money into science education. They appointed 4 committees of master teachers and scientists, one in earth science, one in physics, chemistry, and biology. And these scientists and teachers took a look at the high school textbooks and were appalled, especially in biology, because the high school biology textbooks were not written in the late 1950s, had not been written for decades by scientists. They were written by publishing house people who basically looked around to see what was selling best and cloned it. We'll write our books like the Houghton Mifflin book because they did really well last year. So the biology committee basically just threw out the textbooks and just started anew. And they wrote new textbooks from scratch that were startling. They included evolution. They included human reproduction. Oh my. They included ecology. None of that had been in the books for decades. So it was, and they started, you know, they had to write these books, they had to test them, they had to get them published. They started trickling into high schools in the early 1960s. Well, they hadn't trickled into my school because, of course, schools also take a while before they're actually buying textbooks, and so there's always a lag between what's available and what's actually being used. It wasn't until the late 60s or early 70s that, certainly by the late 60s, that evolution came into the high school curriculum in a big way. It came in because the biology committee textbooks had put it back in, and then Houghton Mifflin and Holt Reinhardt and all the rest of the publishers saw that these books were selling well, so they cloned them. That was a good idea. And they started actually getting scientists to write these books, and that was a big help. So evolution came back into the textbooks in the late 60s, and guess what? The creationists didn't like that at all. There didn't have to be a creationist movement, and this actually answers the lady from Spain's question. I just have a quick comment to answer your question. The reason why, or maybe it was yours, it wasn't a big fuss. The creationists didn't have anything to complain about as long as evolution wasn't in the curriculum. Once evolution came into the curriculum in the late 60s, that's when creation science really started gearing up and the anti-evolution movement started pressing. And by the mid-70s, you started seeing textbook publishers wimping out on evolution again. And so you know, it's this wonderful history that Jerry Skog has tracked, that when evolution is in the textbooks, the creationists get all excited, and it's like a double sine wave. They go after the textbook publishers wimp out, evolution gets out of the textbooks, the creationists, you know, die down because they don't care anymore. Then evolution comes back into the textbooks, and the creationists get all excited again, and it's just this constantly up and down situation. Currently, because somebody's going to ask right next, what about today's textbooks? Currently, evolution is in high school and middle school textbooks, largely as a result of state science standards that require the teaching of evolution. So because it's in the standards, that means the textbook authors are putting evolution into the books, and this is all to the good. Because frankly, unfortunately, in most classrooms, the textbook is really the curriculum, regardless of what the state standards say. More's the pity. But right now, we're in pretty good shape because the national science standards, which of course are just advisory, they say teach evolution. The state standards, almost uniformly, with only about 4 or 5 states, they all say teach evolution. The textbooks have evolution in them, and the creationists are really pissed because, you know, our side is winning. Pass that to the lady next to you, please.
I too am from Wisconsin, and the Freedom of Religion organization is in Madison, and you and their organization do keep track of the far left, pretty much, or the far right, pretty much. This has got a hum to it. Like this?
It's peculiar. I wonder why. What is it about you?
Magnetic.
He doesn't like Wisconsin.
Right. In Wisconsin, they also keep track of the far right pretty thoroughly, and you might add into your equation here some of the things that they found. After Goldwater lost really, really badly in '64, there was an organization, a reorganization of the corporations that started funding the far right to provide the energy for the Republican Party. And it was that partnership, according to the people that I talked to in Madison, who greatly energized this movement, this far right movement. And so you might add that to your equation. They're well funded, and the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee is notorious for funding this kind of thing. You know, add that.
Thank you. Let's get to this lady back here. I'll come back over to you.
I just wondered, despite national laws, what ratio, do you have any numbers on the public schools that actually do teach some creationism or slip that into the curriculum in some way?
You know, that is such a tough question to answer, because once the classroom door is shut, who knows what goes on? Young man, how many times do you come back from school and say, guess what we learned in school today, Mom? Not very often, I'll bet. Okay. So we really don't know what goes on in the classroom. And you know, you can survey teachers and ask them how many of you are teaching creationism. 13% admitted.
Really?
Yeah.
You had talked about how once the creation science argument got struck down in court, that the proponents of that evolved their argument towards the intelligent design argument, which then is with the Kitzmiller and Dover court case and others. They basically lost that argument as well. My understanding is that they've re-evolved the argument again now to the academic freedom argument. Could you talk something about that and why it's an invalid argument?
Yeah, the creationism du jour is to repackage creationism in the context of teaching critical thinking to students, which, raise your hand if you're against critical thinking, right? Of course, everybody wants their kids to be critical thinkers, right? What I tell you, damn it. Well, that's an interesting observation there, too. And it's a very clever strategy because it taps into this third pillar. You know, the third pillar, the fairness pillar, the free speech pillar, you know. There's a series of academic freedom acts that have been proposed. We've counted upwards of 40 in the last 5 years, beginning actually with one that in 2004 in Alabama. The academic freedom acts are very clever because they're couched in terms of, well, let's give the students all the evidence and or let us teach the strengths and weaknesses of evolution. It's this whole balancing, you know, fair A and B, plus or minus. Critical analysis of evolution. I love that phrase. I assure you, when you hear the phrase critical analysis of evolution, what that means is criticize evolution. It doesn't really mean critically analyze evolution. It means evidence against evolution. So these academic freedom acts, one of which unfortunately has passed, the Louisiana one, the Louisiana Science Education Act, is law, passed in '08. We're very, you know, it took a year before the implementation guidelines came in, so we're not sure where that's going, but, you know, finding the case where the teacher's teaching creationism under the LSEA is going to be a problem in the best of circumstances. But they're very cleverly phrased. They avoid religion. They avoid any sort of reference to creationism. They're couched in terms of good pedagogy. So it's that third pillar again. Let me just say just a little thing about these bills. I mentioned that there's something like 40 bills that have come up in the last 5-6 years. All but one of these bills has died in committee or been stopped on the floor. When these bills die in committee, it's not by accident and it's not a natural death, if you will. They die because people like you cared enough about what goes on in science classrooms, or cared enough about not having kids be taught religion in the schools, in the science classroom, that they called up their representative and said, you know, Mr. Chairman of the committee, here's why I don't think this bill should be passed. They wrote letters to committee members. They actually did the kind of, you know, grassroots political lobbying that moderates and progressives have tended to be rather lax about, but which religious conservatives have been very good at and have been much better at organizing. There's nothing illegal about the things that they do to get bills passed. It's just that they need to be countered by people who don't agree with them. And so I would encourage any of you, if you get a call from me or any of our NCSE members, to write a letter to the editor or to write a state legislator about a bill that's coming up, to please do so. If one of your colleagues or one of your neighbors asks you to do something, take a stand politically, it's not going to take you that long to do it, and it's extremely important. One typed letter from a constituent is so much better than all of those MoveOn.org petitions that we all sign. Okay? But, you know, one personal letter is going to have a much, much more important effect. There's somebody over in this area, I thought, that had a... Okay.
In answer to the question of where it comes from, came up, fear dominates human behavior, in my opinion. And when you really find the creationists who's going down in the trenches with you, it often comes down to if I'm involved, I'm not in the image of God. And I think that's a lot of it. Many people are concerned, but they're going to lose their humanness.
Need to talk a little bit more.
Oh, they're going to lose their humanness if they are just evolved from Cambodia or what have you. And I don't think I've ever seen that particular question raised professionally And so maybe this is the opportunity.
No, the human exceptionalism is what you're talking about. The idea that we are different from all other organisms is, I agree, one of the sticking points for many people in accepting evolution. It's more the case, well, I shouldn't say that. Conservative Christians feel that way in addition to the biblical literalism, but many mainstream Christians also just don't really feel comfortable with being descended from animals. It's what a theologian friend of mine, Ted Peters, a Lutheran theologian, calls the ick factor. Monkeys are these smelly creatures in the zoo that throw feces at me. I mean, who wants to be related to them, right? I mean, I can tell you lots of stories about how wonderful monkeys are. We can both tell you wonderful stories about how great monkeys are, but that's not they got a bad press. I mean, at least snakes aren't our closest relatives. I mean, it could be a great deal worse. Well, I mean, because snakes get even worse press, I mean, I like snakes. I think snakes are nice, but they got bad press. They definitely have bad press. You know what I think? Maybe it's your glass or something. I don't know.
Must be the feeling in your too.
Before it was all right.
Okay, go for it. Take it, go for it.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'll ask a question as a sort of an observer. What I'm wondering is this kind of intransient polarity. I'm trying to imagine how it's going to unfold in a good way. So what is the strategy? I mean, it's like an immovable object being hit by irresistible force. And I've been in research. I'm also a designer, not a...
We hope you're intelligent.
I've worked with scientists. There's a certain lack of humility. There's a lack of dialogue sometimes. There are things of value that need to be discussed that aren't a matter of description. So how do you move this beyond this polarity? Because there's a lot of systemic other issues in play, and some of the most popular scientific writers are very sort of disrespectful of human beings and of empathy and love and the ability to be human. So I sort of feel sorry for people who are offended by this kind of, it's like my way or the highway, or there's no dialogue, there's no way out of this, and who wants to get into another fight? I mean, we're in how many wars now, how many religious conflicts?
Pass it to that lady over there.
There's always been, there was the Enlightenment, right? And then there was the Romantic era. And there's this scientific era. And maybe we're back into another, it's a dialectic thing. And I don't know how we're going to avoid it. The trick is to have people like her and people like the Freedom of Religion group that are adamant. It's not going to go that far in that direction. It's going to stay somewhere here. And it's going on in our Western culture forever, Right?
Do you have a response? Somebody over here had a comment, I thought. Going once.
I really like your comments. Thank you very much. Because one of the things that I think that we struggle is how do we stop preaching to the choir? And so that's a little bit the science application. If we make videos, are we making the videos to those that are going to watch the video?
Are we making what?
Videos or children's books or whatever. To whom are we making those? To the ones that are going to read them? Because those are the ones we don't need to make the books for, because they want to read them. And so how do we go about to reaching that public that is not completely polarized, that is critical thinker that has renavigated in a way that is completely contrary to sort of this argument of evolution, yet is not completely closed-minded, or is it, so how do we reach that level?
Can I add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do we, as those who believe in advancing scientific literacy, how can we leverage new media and all out skeptic guide to the universe to talking not just to the echo chamber of ourselves, but to touching those in the middle, or even those across the line, as it were?
I guess I'm a non-scientist, like, to the extreme. I was the kid in high school, and I grew up in a small town in Montana who struggled with math and science, and I had an ongoing debate with my mother about where she said, you just think that because you're a girl and you've been told you can't do it, and so you don't think you like it. And that's a whole other issue. And I'm actually a lawyer now, and that's also a whole other issue. But hello, my name is Beth. I'm an attorney. No, I am somebody who always resisted science, and not in a like I'm a crazy Christian sort of way, but in a just I don't get it sort of way. In a I don't understand it because that's not where my intelligence lies kind of way. And so for me, it's been as an adult sort of trying to seek out accessible science that's interesting to me. And most of the people I know are not scientists, but they're, I think, smart, interested people in society. And I find that things like podcasts that aren't heavy on sort of technical sort of education are really accessible and a great way for me as somebody who's not this like, oh, Beth's really into science and she's going to lecture us right now, but as like, oh, have you listened to this? It's actually really funny, like to sort of
humor is another.
Yeah, to get it to people in a different way. And maybe I'm a little bit preaching to the choir too, because I don't have a lot of fundamentalist friends, but I think that there's a lot of ways to make science interesting to non-scientists out there.
I agree. I think what kind of evolved from this discussion over here, there's at least three populations that we're interested in. I mean, there are people who, like us, I assume, nobody is a little closet creationist in the corner here or something, but people who accept evolution, like science, etc. At the other extreme, there are primarily religious conservatives who are really opposed to evolution, don't want their kids to learn it, etc. But most Americans are in between. Most Americans are this big, broad swath of people. They're not biblically literalist, although most Americans are religious. But they really don't know very much science for whatever reason, inclination or instruction or whatever. Science never really grabbed them. Actually, both of those groups are reachable, but they're reachable in different ways and maybe by different reachers, so to speak. Science cafes are great ways of interesting people who are casual science fans. Okay, my NCSE membership, we're not all scientists, believe me. The majority of, well, we haven't done a survey in a while, but I suspect the majority of NCSE members now are science fans, not scientists. Probably science fans and civil libertarians are our major constituency. Next is scientists, and bringing in a small third is teachers, even though they're in one respect the people we serve, but nonetheless. To reach that big middle group of Americans who are not opposed to science, I mean, that's another thing. We've got survey research that shows that Americans really like science. When you ask Americans to rank occupations from most prestigious to least and all that, we're like second or third. Physicians are always on top, but scientists are right up there, easily within the car salesmen. No, not lawyers. Lawyers aren't that bad. Politicians and car salesmen are the people who are way at the bottom. But scientists have good press. Science has a good press. And you ask Americans, are you interested in learning more about science? And by and large, we do want to learn more about it. So figuring out a way to make science accessible and interesting and maybe fun and funny. I mean, there's a number of things that I think scientists can do, but also people, you know, I bet you a lot of the podcasts you listen to are not necessarily done by professional scientists. They're done by science fans who love science and, you know, just can't wait to tell somebody else about this neat new thing they just learned about. I mean, I find those to be the best podcasts that I listen to, and I prefer being on those people's, you know, shows when I can. So I think, and I think professional scientists, of whom there are many in this room, can also try harder to be more accessible. I think, I can't say I completely agree with the man in the brown sweater that scientists have any higher propensity to being rude and arrogant and standoffish than accountants, frankly. I mean, I don't think we're any worse than any other profession. You get accountants talking about their profession and they're just as incomprehensible as scientists are talking about ours. Certainly my experience in talking with scientists, you know, they're very confused about why people don't get it about science more. And it's not, I don't get the feeling from the scientists that I deal with, and you know, I deal with a lot of scientists. I can't say that it's a random sample, but there's so many scientists are just really deeply concerned with how they can do a better job. Now that said, there's some scientists who are just terrible communicators, and maybe they should just stay in the lab and not try. But you know, from each according to his abilities, so to speak. And you can learn to be a better communicator, even though some people, you know, have a gift for it. You know, they're the Sean Carrolls and the Carl Zimmers of the world. They just have a gift for community. And Richard Dawkins has a gift for finding the analogy that just makes it so clear. I could work for a whole weekend and not come up with more than one or two analogies that Richard just seems to come up with spontaneously at the microphone. So I don't know. I you know, maybe it's a matter of experience as to how rude and unpleasant scientists are. He's going to defend himself.
Yeah, maybe I should reframe it in a way that there's a lack of awe.
Oh my. You need to talk to more scientists.
No, talk to them. I've worked with Nobel laureates, and they're wonderful people. That's not the people who push kitties that glow green in the dark and things like that. It's like, how does science become collegial with the rest of us in the world who aren't extreme, but we're intelligent, thoughtful, description and explanation do not prescribe action. It's a different piece. That's where designers and others come in. So we need to work on this together, but it's tough. Trust me.
It is tough.
It's really tough.
The lady over there.
I get in on. I just have to get in on this conversation.
Yay.
I don't know if this is a good idea for me or not. I'm kind of loud.
It's fine.
If I hold it back enough, we might find the balance. In response to the general discussion, which I think is so interesting and important, I would offer that maybe the arts has an important role to play here. People mentioned the history of Western civilization a little bit. Science emerged from a period of dogmatic scholasticism, and it was a major breakthrough. It was fresh. People were rediscovering through discovery new facts and sharing among themselves these exciting discoveries that they could in fact reproduce for themselves. They could see that it was true. They didn't have to rely on dusty texts or even modern textbooks that said this is the law of science. There's something overwhelming to the individual psyche, and a tentative nature of science can be crushed by these textbooks. And if we get sloppy in our science, it turns into a kind of scientism, where we preach science instead of teach science. And we miss half of our students because they never understand this tentative undertaking that makes them equal to us fundamentally. that we are all the touchstone of scientific truth. And there's a humility to that, but also this great mediator between opinion. And I think it's so important that we can't allow that to be lost. And I guess I would offer that there's a role for the interdisciplinary seminar here, where people talk about the difference between other forms of inquiry. Dare I say, metaphysics has relevance in the modern university because that's precisely the discipline that distinguishes between philosophical knowledge, theological knowledge, scientific knowledge, mathematical knowledge, and we understand where our similarities and points of departure actually are. And we retain a deeper understanding of the field of knowledge, and science can assume its proper place with relation to facts and things that can be measured and observed. But then the question of origins remains open as a theological or philosophical question that science simply can't touch at the end of the day. It can either disprove God or prove God. And so we can be united in a sense and agree on the facts, but gain respect for the differences of opinion that are beyond the realm of measurement. So I offer that.
You read that. I saw you read it.
I wrote a lot.
You're not married yet, right?
Oh, I am. I am. 30 years, I still love to see him walking the room. I graduated in 1961 from high school in a very conservative Southern California town. I had evolution. I had a great science teacher. His name was Braswell. You can imagine what us students did with that on bad days. The fact is, he taught science, he taught evolution. The other part of that man was, on the weekends, he was a minister. He was in, I'm trying to remember, I believe he was Baptist, but if he wasn't a Baptist, he was a Methodist. And he stood in class at the beginning of class and he said, I can neither prove nor disprove. But if you're going to be educated, you're going to understand scientific theory. That's it.
The lady over there in the red. No, that right here, right here.
This is a phenomenal discussion. It's piqued my curiosity in terms of this issue of certainty versus uncertainty. And I think that having this wonderful discussion is great for people that accept uncertainty. But I don't believe that it's a great discussion in terms of people that don't accept uncertainty, that require certainty. And so I guess I'm kind of curious what you think about how it is that we help people understand that uncertainty is a part of science. It's what drives science. It's what pushes science forward. That certainty is not something that's necessary in science, and especially evolutionary science. I mean, certainly the whole biology of human history would be something completely different if we demanded certainty. So I'm just curious, and I'd like people to comment on this issue of how, as scientists, we help people understand that uncertainty is so important.
I distinguish between certainty and certainty. Okay, there's a physicist friend of mine, some of you know, he writes a lot for the published, named James Trefil. And many, many years ago, he wrote this great article, A Consumer's Guide to Pseudoscience. It was wonderful, a popular article. But in it, he had and a little image that I've used over and over and over when I've talked about the nature of science. He was talking about the content of science. And he was talking about how, we don't have PowerPoint here, so just cope. Think of a series of, yes, thank goodness, a series of concentric circles. In the middle of the series is the core ideas of science. These are the ideas that are very well tested. We have a lot of confidence in them because they've worked really well for a long time. They've met every test. Nobody's really actively testing these anymore. Second law of thermodynamics, here to stay. Geocentrism versus heliocentrism, heliocentrism won. Common ancestry versus special creation, common ancestry. Particulate inheritance over blending, particulate wins. There's a lot of these basic, core ideas of science. Around the core ideas, This is your PowerPoint visualization here. The second concentric circle is the frontier of science. Now, this is what you all scientists are working on now, okay? There are lots of hypotheses being tested any day in any university by any department. Most of them will turn out to be wrong. Some of them will turn out to be right. You'll get lucky. You'll do a good job, whatever. But the active bustle of science, so to speak, where there's a lot of uncertainty, indeed, where you're not really sure that you're really measuring all your variables right or holding constant certain ones. So there's a lot of, 2 steps forward, 1 step sideways, half step back, maybe a lurch forward, and that's kind of the frontier area of science. The outermost of these concentric circles is the fringe. Now, the fringe ideas of science are the ones that scientists really aren't spending any time on, but which there often tends to be a great deal of public interest. Certainly creation science would be a fringe idea of science. Now intelligent design, because its claims have been tested, it is a fringe idea of science, although to many members of the public it's right there. If you go on the internet and you Google free energy, you will find lots of money-making opportunities to invest in free energy machines, which will generate electricity and solve our carbon problem, solve our energy problem, everything. There will be nothing but good times ahead, and send your check here. Now, you don't find physicists investing in free energy machines because these are in direct violation of the second and third laws of thermodynamics. They are basically perpetual motion machines, okay? And we know those don't work. The fringe ideas are considered fringe because they violate some core principle of science in which we have a lot of confidence, okay? Now, when I say certainty versus certainty, there are some things in science that, yeah, we're really certain about. Nobody's really going out there and saying, heliocentrism, maybe not. On the other hand, there's a lot of details about planetary motion that I'm sure planetary astronomers are debating. Nobody is really debating whether living things had common ancestries, because that inference is so well founded from so many different sources of information that that's a starting point. We're not out there actively testing, although, we could come across some observations that would make us question common ancestry, in which case that'd be very interesting. But nobody's really actively out there trying to figure out the lab experiment that would test common ancestry. It generates lots of frontier science, which is where the uncertainty, when we're studying the details of evolution, the pattern and process kinds of questions, that's where that's where I think we have to help our students understand that, yes, there's a lot of uncertainty because we may not know all the variables, and we may be fooling ourselves in some cases when we're looking at our tests, and because we're only human, and on and on. But, as much as I admire Steve Gould, I think he did us all a disservice in a lot of those natural history columns, because he hammered away over and over and over about science is open-ended, everything in science is open, and we're always changing our minds. And what I think that does is undermine the reliability of science. And that feeds into this whole postmodernist horseshit, pardon me. But I have no toleration for postmodernism and as views of science. But it feeds those views that, well, any explanation is as good as any other explanation. Well, when it comes to the natural world, that's not true, because we're not really dealing with opinion here. You know what I mean? When it comes to to really explaining the natural world, not the meaning of the natural world, not how we feel about it, not a whole lot of other things that are really important, and I'm with you. But if we want to know why water flows downhill, the really basic, if we want to know why cells divide, we go to science, because we know that this technique really works. So I think what we have to communicate to our students and to the general public is that science is this balance between certainty and openness. Science is reliable, but at the same time, indeed, we are perfectly willing to question even those core ideas. But there has to be very, very good reason to question those core ideas because they have stood the test of time for so long. And we might dicker about what is a core idea, what is a frontier idea, and that's fine too. But just the basic principle that there is reliability in science, and at the same time there is the flexibility, the openness, the willingness, the uncertainty. But I think we really need to, we need to have that balance, if that makes sense to you. If that, this young man back here has got an opinion for us, or an observation.
Well, how they're saying that we evolved from apes, or the apes evolved from like plants or some sort of organism. I'm wondering how these organisms were actually placed on Earth, like how they formed, or if a higher power put them on the Earth. Like, just like I'm not kind of just wondering like how they get here.
If I were a religious person, I would be able to offer a suggestion to you. If another religious person might be able to offer a different suggestion to you. 2 or 3 different Christians could offer 2 or 3 different suggestions to you. If you were to talk to a Navajo Indian, he would have yet another suggestion for you, another explanation. If you were to talk to a Hindu, there'd be yet another one. If you were to talk to a scientist, you'd pretty much get one answer, and that is that people and apes and plants and all the other animals and creatures that we see, plants and animals that we see, all are related to each other like a big family tree. Just like, you and your brothers and sisters are the children of your father, and then your cousins and you are the offspring of your, ultimately can trace your ancestry back to your to your grandpa. And if you had second cousins, you go back to your great-grandpa, and on and on and on. So every living thing on the planet, plants or animals, eventually could be fit, if we had all the information, into a big branching tree of life. Now, we'd have some differences, as scientists, we'd have some differences of opinions as to where some organisms would go and who's more closely related to others on that big family tree of life. But basically, we'd have that general idea. Now, your question specifically was, how did this all get started, I think. Different religious people would give you different religious explanations. A scientist would tell you that as scientists, we have to deal with just natural explanations, and it's not because all scientists are atheists. It's because they aren't. That's wrong right there. But it's because when we're wearing our scientist hat, when we're being scientists, we have to follow certain rules. And just like if you're playing baseball, you don't bring a basketball onto the pitcher's mound. There are certain rules that you have to follow. Science has its rules as well. In the game of science, and one of the rules of science is that because we have to test our explanations, we can't use God as part of the explanation, because you can't put God in a test tube. You can't control for the efforts of God, so to speak. We can't hold God constant. So because you can't keep God in or out of the test tube, you just set God aside, which is very different from saying that God doesn't exist. You can't say that with science. But you do have to set God aside and just stumble along best you can with natural explanations. So a scientist would answer the question of, how do you deal with the very first example of life on Earth with a natural explanation? And basically it has to do with, how do you define life? And life is defined by scientists as something that can take in energy from the surrounding, metabolism in other words, and reproduce. And if you've got something that can take in energy and it can reproduce, and you've got it in a membrane, you've got something that can evolve. Now, where did that first structure that was within a membrane, could reproduce and could take in energy, could metabolize and could reproduce, where'd that come from? We don't have agreement among scientists as to the steps that would have led to that point. Once you get that point, then evolution is very explainable. But getting to that point is something that scientists still have a lot of debate on. We've got pieces of it. You know, we've got pretty good ideas of how to go from inorganic chemicals to organic chemicals, organic ones being the ones involved in life. We've got some pretty interesting ideas about how you get membranes from various kinds of lipid structures that are hydrophilic on one side and hydrophobic on another side, and all that kind of cool stuff that they're doing at Santa Cruz. We've got some ideas about how you can get reproductive structures like RNA and DNA, but still a lot of holes, you know, still a lot of additional research that needs to be done to get the full picture. But as a scientist, we can only deal with natural causes. Whether there is supernatural causes, that's a matter for your individual philosophy or your individual theology. That's outside of what science can tell you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I just have one more question.
Sure.
Well, how they are saying that if you can prove that the Earth hasn't been around for as long as
billions of years.
Yeah. Well, if they're saying, you know, like dinosaurs have been around for like 73 million years, does that sort of prove that, or not that exactly that people who believe in evolution, that they're right, but that kind of support their belief?
The creationists are trying very hard to prove that the Earth is only a few thousand years old. Because if indeed the Earth is only a few thousand years old, there's not enough time for the huge variety of living things to have evolved from common ancestors. So they exert a lot of effort trying to prove that. Unsuccessfully, according to most of the geologists, I might add. You know, this has been the quietest table over here. Come on, you guys. This is the only man who's stood up with a statement here. Oh, Parasite Rex. Speaking of Carl Zimmer, isn't he great? All right. Who's going to be the next person to offer us an observation? I knew we'd talk her into it. Start small. If you have roommates, if you have people in your dorm, if you have a honey, if you have, you know, I'm becoming more and more convinced that we have the biggest effect upon one another when we deal in small groups. I mean, when we just talk to each other over the back fence or in the supermarket checkout line or sitting down over a beer in the student union. Do you have beer in your student union? Whatever. That kind of person-to-person communication, I think, probably does more to increase understanding than anything else. I mean, your point, and a couple of other people were talking about, we need to talk to each other. We need to do that on a variety of scales. And I think we need to do a whole lot more of the small-scale talking. I mean, I do a drive-by science, I really do. I mean, I show up and I talk for an hour and then I leave, and you know, the faculty has to pick up the pieces after I go. But if I were actually teaching a semester-long course or a TA for a science class, if you've got repeated contact with somebody, like with your students or your friends, you have so much more of an opportunity to make a difference in that person's understanding, because you can revisit issues over and over. And I mean, you know, the first thing you have to think about is that you rarely will ever make a substantial change in somebody's attitudes or opinions in one pass. I mean, I never believe that I give these public lectures and people smack themselves in the forehead and say, oh, that's it. You know, forever I am now changed in my opinions toward evolution. I mean, I know better than that. But I feel that if I can just crack the door a little bit, then the next time maybe their professor or their friend sits down and talks to you know, whether they're in that middle group of people or that conservative group of people. Maybe the next time somebody talks to them with maybe even the same message or much the same information, that door will get cracked a little bit wider and a little bit more understanding will manage to seep in. You know, human beings are funny animals, we really are. We're very complicated creatures psychologically, and we have lots of barriers to understanding. Even those of us who pride ourselves on our logical and rational and empirical orientation, we still have our ideologies that we hold near and dear to us, and you know, we have to be very careful to try to be more open, but you know, even those of us who are aware of it are not always as good as we should be, and if you're not aware of it, you're even less likely to be open to new ideas. So I would, you know, start small. Understand as much about the nature of science and as much about evolution as you can. Get it really well understood in your own brain, and practice, you know? The first time you explain something to someone, it's not going to come out as well as the second, fourth, and 15th time you explain it. And if you figure out a good way to explain something, keep using it. I knew we'd inspire this table. See, all the rest of you are so inspiring with your commentary here.
I've been a high school science, biology, and chemistry teacher for 12 years.
Excellent.
And I'm not currently doing that now. But I'm also a graduate of theological seminary. I have a master's in historical theology. And when I was in seminary, I was fortunate enough to be taught the historical critical methods of interpretation, which is a scientific method. And that led me to some interesting conclusions. So I had to kind of juxtaposition both my science background and my theological training. And I found that understanding how theology works made me understand how it dovetails with a critical method of learning, like in my science bachelor's background. So I guess I see that the two can have certain compatibilities if that same method, scientific method, is used.
I agree. I mean, I'm a non-believer myself, but I hang out with a lot of theologians who take a lot of the same attitude. It's a scholarly endeavor, okay? Whether you call it science or not, it is a scholarly endeavor, and there are certain concomitants to all scholarly endeavors that are similar, whether it's science or good history or good art criticism or whatever. And basically it's the same kind of critical thinking, testing orientation that we find just natural in science, but which is not unique to science. It is also present in, I think, all good scholarly activity.
Well, our visiting scientist, Eugenie Scott, has been on the spot for an hour and a half, and she looks like she's getting tired.
Time flies.
So I think we've just about, unless anybody has any real pressing questions, I think we will.
The man against
one more, and then we're
the
going
man against the wall
officially conclude.
had his hands, and he didn't.
This is partially a response to this young woman's question about what to do, what is to be done. She asked you. And also, I'd like to respond to the man in the brown sweater, who I think made a powerful point, as well as this woman in the red sweater, who also made a powerful point about adopting how shall I say, a less arrogant and more conciliatory position. So I think part of the fear of that segment of the population that's obsessed with creationism to be sort of captured by Dostoevsky's statement that without God, everything is permitted. But Dostoevsky also said that beauty will save the world. And I would submit to you that creationists and scientists alike have a touchstone in beauty, and that rather than, I wouldn't say rather than, but in addition to articulating, the methodology of science, the particular dominant paradigms that you're picking up as a graduate student, that you should beat the drum of beauty. Because this is something that all of us can understand, whether we're artists, whether, God forbid, we're lawyers.
Hey, I'm married to a lawyer.
But we all respond to the beautiful in nature. And this provides, I think, the most powerful touchstone of all. And I think I would urge you to approach your students, your discipline, and this consideration of beauty of the natural world with love. Loving your students, loving what is beautiful in nature, loving the process of discovery that is essentially scientific. And I'm not trying to sort of sing Kumbaya, with a 19th century Russian, over my shoulder. But I do think that those things, beauty and love, apply to our job as scientists, can win a lot of hearts.
Seems like a good place to end.
Well, I want to thank all of you people who helped out. You guys make the Science Cafe successful, and also another hand for our visiting scientists.